NVIDIA may be America's top performing stock after more than doubling this year alone. But if you're holding NVIDIA or thinking of buying it to get a stake in the $7 trillion AI market, you're going to want to see Mark Chaikin's new AI prediction first. Mark is a regular on many major news outlets from Fox Business to CNBC, and built the stock indicator Wall Street uses to find winning stocks. His award-winning system flashed buy on Tesla before it climbed 335%, Moderna before it climbed 300%, and Riot Blockchain before it climbed 10,090%. It also found NVIDIA at the start of 2023 before its massive bull run. But right now, Mark is stepping forward to warn people to stay away from NVIDIA. My system has indicated that NVIDIA is no longer the best stock to buy to profit from AI, Mark says. In fact, it just flashed buy on a totally different AI stock. And today, he'd like to hand you the name and ticker symbol of his #1 AI stock to buy right now. For a limited time, you can get this information for free at AIfrenzy2023.com. Again, that's AIfrenzy2023.com for a free copy of his new report. Hi, this is Daniela Cambone, and welcome back to the Daniela Cambone Show. Well, one of the world's most powerful CEOs has come out with a very strong and shocking comment. JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon saying that we are living in perhaps the most dangerous time the world has seen in decades. I'm going to be getting my next guest thought on this and so much more. Please welcome to the program Peter Zeihan. You must know him from his YouTube channel, Zeihan on Politics. He's also the best-selling author of The Accidental Superpower and The End of the World is Just Beginning. He's also a keynote speaker at our Alliance Conference, the Stansberry Alliance Conference, happening right now in Las Vegas. That's where he joins me. Peter, wish I could be there with you. Thanks for joining me this evening.
You're missing a great time in Vegas, just saying.
Well, like I said, I wish I could be there with you, but I'm holding down the fort in New York City. Excited to get, well, I don't know if excited is the right word, a little concerned to get your viewpoint on the latest from JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon. I mean, strong statement here. Most dangerous time that we've seen in the last decade.
In the last decade, absolutely. But honestly, we have been there now for a year and a half. What's going on in Gaza is unfortunate and it's awful. But it hasn't been since the 70s that something that happens between the Palestinians and the Israelis has had any impact on any meaningful markets. Obviously, that was OPEC and that was the energy sector, but this is a region that does not produce or consume much or transit really anything. So it makes great headlines and it involves the United States from any number of cultural angles, but it's not an economic issue. The issue is and always has been Ukraine, because we've got a country that has nukes that is dying here. And on their way out the door, the capacity of the Russian system to do immense damage is very, very real.
So interesting to get, your thoughts that you don't feel the economic burden will be so big. I mean, what about food and the impact on supply chains and energy? I mean, won't those repercussions be felt, Peter?
Every single one of those is true for Ukraine. Russia is the world's largest oil exporter, the world's largest natural gas producer, the world's largest wheat exporter. Ukraine is the world's 5th largest wheat exporter. It's the largest exporter of oil seeds. All of that holds for Ukraine. Israel is a tech-based economy with under 7 million people, and the Palestinian areas that are in question here, Gaza is an open-air prison with nothing of economic value. One of these matters much more
Peter,
than the other.
I mean, you did a real in-depth video on your YouTube channel, which I invite everyone to watch, where you kind of do a rapid-fire Q&A. But I want to talk about some of the main points you brought up. Mainly, you say, or you explain, you give your viewpoint on how Israel may have missed this. I mean, you say that their security, their intel is one of the gold standards in the world. So if you could share a little bit with our audience of how they missed this.
Well, we're talking about guesswork here because the postmortem hasn't yet been done, but this clearly should not have happened. Every cell phone, every text message that is sent in the Palestinian territories goes through Israeli cell towers. Their power grid is provided with fuel that is provided by the Israelis, same with their food distribution system. And the Israelis really only have two security concerns. Number one is Iran, and the number two is Gaza, and they border Gaza. So every focus that the Israelis should have been on this little speck of territory, and they missed everything. We're talking about hundreds of fighters who coordinated efforts down to the tactical level from a half a dozen approaches, and yet somehow none of this information percolated up. Now, we can make guesses. We can talk about the general incompetence of the current government. That's a reasonable discussion to have. We can talk about how the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has spent the last 10 years fighting the culture war rather than dealing with actual security issues. But at this point, all we know is that they failed utterly, and that means any military operation that has started in the last week is starting with next to no intelligence to guide it. And that suggests that the next few weeks are going to be pretty brutal, no matter how anything else goes down.
You talk about the potential of a toppling of the Israeli government.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a foregone conclusion at this point. The Netanyahu government is not supported by the normal left versus right versus center coalitions that have dominated Israeli governments for the last 60 years. Instead, it's entirely focused on the religious right, people with very little experience in the real world, much less in government, much less in security. They were able to get the votes because there's a different sort of political economy in the Israeli system compared to most of the other Western nations, where you're going to have a lot more from business. You basically have a large chunk of the population who studies the Torah and as a result hasn't really had any sort of real life education or expertise. And people representing those voters are the dominant bloc within the government coalition right now. And that's made it easy for someone on the outside to say, this is not the mix of things that give you a broad spectrum competent government. And I am afraid that we have seen very, very decisively where that leads.
Peter, I want to get back to your point about the economic impact, the political impact. I mean, for now, but what if this extends to Iran, Saudi Arabia? I mean, the US is already involved. Egypt, Lebanon. I mean, I've had guests on here talking about World War III.
No. Let's go through and knock these off one after the other. Egypt is an ally, and the Egyptians have actually sealed the border with Gaza for most of the time since Saturday. They loathe the Palestinians, and if you remember, Egypt used to control the West Bank between roughly 1949 and 1973. There's no love lost there. Lebanon is a borderline failed state. And even if Hezbollah were to launch an attack, Hezbollah doesn't have an army. It also doesn't have an economy. So if Lebanon were to fall off the face of the earth tomorrow, from an economic point of view, the issues would be minor. Syria is in a civil war. They're not a concern. Jordan is a satellite that lives on aid, a lot of which is funneled through Israel. So for all of the immediate neighbors, there's really no economic question there to even ask. Iran is a possibility, but the Iranians think of the Palestinians, especially of Hamas, as a disposable asset. Remember that the Iranians are ethnically Persian and religiously Shia versus Hamas, which is ethnically Arab and religiously Sunni. The Iranians see the Palestinians as, at best, apostates. And so there's not as much of a link there as you might think. And even if I'm wrong, and even if the Iranians do get involved, over the course of the last 10 years, Iran's oil exports have dropped precipitously. They only produce about 1 million barrels a day now. I'm not suggesting that if that vanished from the market, we wouldn't feel it, but that's the kind of thing that the system can get along without. The one that matters, the one you brought up, more than everything else put together by a factor of 10, is Saudi Arabia. When the Saudis had an issue with the Palestinians back in the 70s, they created what we now know today as OPEC. And there is an open question of the degree to which the Saudi royal family is going to get involved in this. But it's probably not from the angle that most people think. There's a generational split in Saudi Arabia. You've got the king's generation, King Salman, who thinks the Palestinian cause is worth fighting for. And then you've got the younger generation, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, who just thinks of them as a historical aberration that should not hold down the Saudis at all. Mohammed bin Salman, who will be the next king, wants to just throw the Palestinians under the bus, and the whole idea of a peace treaty between Israel and Saudi Arabia is his idea. So we're going to find out which generation is actually holding the cards in this relationship, and that's going to be very instructive. If I was a betting man, I would say that by the end of this calendar year, the Saudis will have, in essence, declared neutrality, and the talks between Jerusalem and Riyadh will pick up again.
Let's just play out if Iran was involved in the attack. What were they looking to gain?
Anything that would sabotage the talks between Saudi Arabia and Israel, the Iranians would see as a plus. Under the Trump administration, Morocco and the United Arab Emirates both basically joined the Egyptians in recognizing the existence of the State of Israel. And if the Saudis were to join that coalition, you can pretty much guarantee that all the other Arab countries in one way or another would follow suit within the next few years. And then you're talking about a very different Middle East. If you've got all the Sunni Muslims with the vast majority of the area's population and economy all on one side facing down Iran, then it doesn't really matter what the United States does, because Iran has been the odd man out, much poorer than the others, and isolated diplomatically and economically. Anything that the Iranians can do to throw a spanner into those talks was a plus.
I know we're talking about a lot of hypotheticals here, but if Donald Trump returns to office, how does this change? Does this change the course of anything?
Well, two things. Number one, Donald Trump is going to win the nomination but lose the general. That's a whole different topic we can go into. But hypothetically, if he were to come back, you know those bang snap firecrackers you had as a kid that you just kind of throw them on the ground and makes people jump? Trump in the Middle East is basically throwing handfuls of that every 5 minutes. That doesn't mean he doesn't have an impact. It means he doesn't have an organized impact. And this area is in the process of beating to it or moving to its own drum as opposed to what the United States wants. Remember, love it or hate it, under Trump and Biden, we have withdrawn almost all of our forces from the region. And if you don't have forces in the Middle East, you can't manipulate it very well.
Peter, I'm a little surprised. Okay, let's go there because you brought it up. You think he wouldn't win the election? Because what I'm hearing after what's happened in the Middle East, and it started with talk when Russia invaded Ukraine, but now it's like the victory is sealed for Trump.
Well, he will definitely win the nomination. If everyone on the Republican field were to consolidate behind a single player now, I think Trump would still win, even from prison. His hold on the base is just too powerful. We've seen two things go down in the Republican Party. One that guarantees that Trump will win the nomination, one that guarantees he will lose the general. First, he has mobilized a new group of voters, the populists, based on whoever's numbers you're using, are generally accepted now to be the single largest voting bloc in the country. And they are his people, and they will show up to primaries if he asks them to. And so the nomination's in the bag. But he has driven away fiscal voters and military voters and business community and law and order voters, which means that he can't possibly win the general election. The reason that Republicans have done so well these past 45 years is they've had a coalition that hasn't fought among themselves. But what Trump has done is he's triggered infighting. And his coalition just doesn't have the numbers if that infighting is happening. This is usually a problem that the Democrats have. Usually they have more numbers but more infighting. Now Trump has created a coalition that has fewer numbers and infighting, and the numbers just aren't there. God forbid the independents show up, because we saw in the midterms that they don't care for Trump very much. And if they did that at the midterms, you can pretty much guarantee they're going to show up at the general.
So RFK for you?
Well, I think the technical term is waste of skin. But in case of the general election, him running as an independent will split the batshit crazy vote, which is certainly going to help the Biden team win re-election.
Okay, interesting. I wanted to bring this up with you. Let's talk a little bit about, you kind of went there, mainstream media coverage of the Middle East war, of terrorism in general. So one thing I had been thinking about, Peter, is where was talk of terrorism during COVID? Did all terrorists just take a sabbatical and say, you know what, we're going to chill out right now? So I went to Statista and looked at number of fatalities due to terrorist attacks. So the height, yes, 2018. But there were still terrorist attacks in 2020, 2021. Now, you may argue, well, they weren't in countries that counted, right? But there was still full-on terrorism. What I'm trying to discuss with you here is the focus on terrorism in media. And would you not agree there was not much talk about terrorism in Syria, Afghanistan, etc. during those COVID years?
What we're seeing around the world from maybe 7 years ago, and what we're going to see for probably another decade, is as the United States reduces its overall position in the world for various reasons, you're going to have a lot of governments that just don't make it. There are a lot of places that the United States has propped up for security reasons. Afghanistan is probably at the very top of that list. And when the United States steps back, or when demographic trends break, or when trade issues shift, a lot of countries lose some coherence. And in that sort of environment, you get battles to see who ultimately will inherit the pieces. Based on where you are politically, you might assign some of those as terrorist. And I think that's a fair assessment. The more discomfort and breakdown we have in the world, the more we're going to have people struggling over what is left over. And as you've pointed out, places that don't matter have more of this from our point of view. We're going to see a lot more of that. And that means places like Syria and Lebanon and Afghanistan, and to a certain degree Pakistan and India, are going to see more of this sort of activity as the center can't hold on to all of the peripheries. That's kind of hardwired into this point. Now, the reason we haven't discussed that is because most of the places we care about, that hasn't happened to them yet. In fact, if you look at the first world, the only one where that center hasn't held so far is Greece. That means the security issue to this point has been quite manageable. That doesn't mean that's how it's going to continue, though.
Well, I mean, in New York City, there was a day of, around the world really, but there was just such heightened security on Friday because of this day of jihad, right? So the rise of terrorist activities around the world because of this, Peter, is that a concern for you?
Increasing terror activity around the world would be a concern, absolutely. Increasing terrorist activity here, not so much. As a rule, when you're fighting over what's left of a system, all of your fights are at home or close to it. So the Kashmiris are concerned with the Indians, the Palestinians are concerned with the Israelis, and so on. Doing a Hail Mary into a different hemisphere to launch an attack doesn't help with local control. You only do that if you're an ideologue and you're trying to get the United States to do something differently. And for Hamas, that doesn't even make the top 10 list.
Peter, since it's our first time speaking, I'm curious to get your thoughts on the rise of the BRICS. I mean, we're talking about misfit countries, and here's a group of countries that, we're not usually invited to the lunch table, but now they're all sitting at the same table. Let's get your thoughts on the BRICS. Is it just a lot of hocus pocus nonsense talk, or do you think they're going to be a force to be reckoned with?
Well, let me answer well, actually, I can answer both of those, no problem. So number one, there's nothing going on yet. In fact, when the South Africa summit happened, the South Africans, the Indians, and the Chinese all said publicly they had no interest in a BRIC currency. They were fine with the dollar. Now, that was missed in the United States because it doesn't match the narrative of this discussion of de-dollarization, which, to be perfectly honest, is not happening. The US dollar is used more in transactions now than ever before. The drop in first world currencies and global trade and currency reserves hasn't been the dollar, it's been the euro. That's what happens when you confiscate insured bank deposits to pay for bailouts, just FYI. That was a bad move. So, no. And there was this lovely discussion between the Indians and the Russians where they were arguing over what currency their trade should be in. And the Russians basically said, I don't want your rubles, I don't want your rupees. And the Indians said, I don't want your rubles. And that was the end of the conversation. So that really is going absolutely nowhere outside of the financial papers in the United States.
What about talk of a common currency that they're developing, one backed by gold?
Yeah. There isn't enough gold on the planet, and the Chinese, the South African Indians have no interest in it. They've said so publicly. And the Russians, to be very clear, don't want a gold-backed currency. They just want everyone to use the ruble.
So you think that they'll never come to like a common front?
No, there is no constellation of economic forces that all of them subscribe to. I mean, they all obviously have significant trading relationships with the Chinese, but the Chinese manipulate their currency vociferously in order to achieve economic and political gains. So no one wants to use the yuan.
Okay.
In fact, the Chinese don't want to use the yuan.
Well, let's talk China here.
Sure.
Because I watched an interview you did with Joe Rogan, where you said you believe China's collapse is imminent with only 10 years remaining before potential disaster. And correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of your thesis is tied to the fact you think they're lying about their population. That's much less than reported.
I don't think they're lying about their population. In the last 3 months, they've come out and said that their data was wrong. In fact, over the course of the last 3 months, they've updated a lot of their data, and they're now admitting publicly that their birth rate has dropped by 70% in just the last 5 years, which is the sharpest decline of any ethnic group in any era in human history. And the Shanghai Academies of Sciences is saying that even this new update is probably wrong, and they've probably overcounted their population by more than 100 million people. So the scope of the downward slide here is just immense.
So it's interesting because before the outbreak of the war in the Middle East, what were we talking about, Peter? We were talking about potential war between USA and China. So what happens to that narrative?
I don't want to rule out the possibility of a conflict. I would just say that we don't know. Chairman Xi has sequestered himself, and he's built such a tight cult of personality that even basic information is not percolating up to the top. So he is broadly unaware of the country of which he is ruling now. We've seen a lot of statistics disappear as a result because the people in the bureaucracy think that making this stuff go away is what Xi wants. This is how he basically made due diligence functionally illegal in the country. This is why COVID data isn't even collected anymore. This is why consumer confidence data isn't collected. So predicting what Xi personally will do now has become a bit of a fool's errand because we don't even know what basic information he's coming out. So, you talk about the battlefield in Ukraine, or you talk about wheat prices, and you can see how that might influence Vladimir Putin's decision-making. But the information isn't making it to Xi. And so we don't know what sort of sea of information he's even operating in, which makes it almost impossible to figure out what he might do. What I can say is when you have this degree of breakdown in information flows, military decision-making kind of goes in the crapper as well.
Peter, just to wrap here, as I mentioned at the start, you're a keynote speaker at the Stansberry Alliance conference in Vegas. It's a room full of investors. I mean, what's your message there?
We're going through the greatest period of economic change in everybody's lives. I mean, this is what's going on right now with the breakdown of globalization, with demographic flips, with what's going on with the Chinese situation. We haven't seen these sort of shocks since a minimum World War II. And what's different about this, and why it's probably in the end going to be much more dramatic than what we've seen, is the population structures have shifted. After 70 years of industrialization, we've had fewer and fewer and fewer kids on the world as a whole. And a lot of advanced countries, Germany, Korea, Taiwan, China, are going to have so many retirees that they can't function as modern systems because they don't have the young people for consumption or the middle-aged folks for production. This all ends this decade. And that changes financial structures. That changes how we manufacture. That changes how we consume. And we don't have a model at the moment for what it looks like on the other side of this. What I can tell you for sure is that the United States has more time than everyone else, because whatever you want to say about the baby boomers, and there's a lot we can say, they did one thing that their cohorts, their peers, and the rest of the world didn't do. They had kids. And so we've got the millennials, and they will save us all.
Wow. That's putting a lot of faith in the millennials. Peter, but I guess it ties in to my opening comments about, Jamie Dimon's latest, because, whether you agree with him or not, I think it's still a dire warning, and it warrants a new way of thinking that investors have to wake up to. So I mean, let's just leave it with this. One takeaway: how should investors be repositioning themselves? What should they be thinking about at night? Is there anything they can do to be better prepared for these changing demographics and times?
Sure. I will never tell people that they should not pay attention to security issues. They have become elevated. They will remain elevated for at least a decade. I agree with Dimon on that completely. However, these changes in population structures are draining the system of capital. We have not, in the next 5 years, we're going to have a capital system where capital is so scarce and so expensive that we have nothing in living memory to compare it to. And if you are in an environment where you have capital in that world, wow, you're going to feel really important because you are.
Peter Zeihan, I appreciate you taking time to speak with me this evening.
It's been a pleasure.
And please continue to watch the Daniela Camboni Show. We'll continue to bring you great interviews from the Stansberry Alliance Conference happening right now in Vegas. That's it for me. And in the meantime, don't forget to sign up at danielacamboni.com. That's it for me. We'll see you soon.
Opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the contributor and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Stansberry Research, its parent company, or affiliates.